Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG Show for Friday, October the 29th, 2021. So, the show today is going to be a little less topical, I suppose, than normal. I want to talk at some length about a few things. It's a piece by Malcolm Pollock called What's Different Now from 2 days ago. And it begins, as things fall apart in America and talk of secession, national divorce, and civil war becomes more common. I've seen some people saying that the 60s were just as bad or worse, and that as bad as things were then, we got through it nevertheless and hung together as a nation. There's something to this, of course. The 60s, which I'm old enough to remember very well, were indeed a troubled time. It seemed that everything was crumbling into chaos: the Vietnam War, race relations, feminism, the pill, the bomb, the hippie counterculture, protests, race riots, and the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK. All of these things were terribly divisive and corrosive. I could see how someone could make a persuasive argument that the nation was in greater danger of coming apart than it is now. Pollock comments, I disagree for two reasons. The first is that we never did really fully recover from the cultural earthquake of the 60s. The bedrock of national cohesion and shared identity was badly fractured in that area, and the damage persists. Whatever we have built back since then has been erected on those weakened foundations. Moreover, the great ideological conflict of the 60s never ended. What happened was that the counterculture consolidated its victories in the nation as a whole, and then its soldiers, most of whom were young, set about burrowing their way into all the nation's institutions of power and influence. That process now being complete, the brood, like a population of locusts, has emerged in its mature form and is prepared to devour everything. The other reason is that, for all its discord and strife, the troubles of the 60s took place in a very different social context. Even at its worst, there was a feeling on both sides that America itself was still a noble idea, that the founding was a triumph of human progress, and that there were objective, natural truths we all could agree on. The conflict of the 60s felt like a family argument, a bad patch we needed to get through before we could be a happy family again. The conflict of the present day, by contrast, is much more like a religious war, a struggle for subjugation and territorial conquest, frankly, a battle for extermination, between bitterly antagonistic nations with nothing in common at all. I was struck by this just the other day when I heard on the radio the old Simon and Garfunkel tune, America. Simon and Garfunkel were most assuredly a part of the 60s counterculture, but that beautiful song was a paean to the shared American mythos. It sang of the great land of liberty that we were all blessed to live in, and of the endless possibilities for transformative experience and self-realization that this vast nation, containing multitudes and contradictions, but nevertheless dedicated in all its different parts to the same founding principles of liberty and opportunity for each of its citizens, however humble, had to offer. In short, despite being a product of an era of cultural revolution, the song expressed with deep and appealing motion the traditional romantic ideal of America, and as such, it was profoundly, movingly patriotic. That was then. It is hard even to imagine such a song with its poignant affection for the commonality of the American experience, bridging that chasm that separates our warring factions today. It would seem naive at best, and it would almost certainly be seen by the clerisy of our new secular religion as a manifestation of false consciousness to be denounced and reviled for giving comfort to the enemy. So yes, the 60s were bad, Pollock concludes, and set the stage for the crisis we are living through today. But if our situation in 2021 resembles any previous decade of American history, it is not the 1960s, it is the 1850s. Well, I am old enough to remember the 1960s very well, and I agree overwhelmingly with what Pollock has to say. I have a few cavils. You know, if one watches a PBS, which every day or several times a week has some sort of celebration of one of the facets of the 1960s, one gets the impression that America, or all of America, or the vast majority of it, simply bought into what the 60s and the counterculture were saying. And it's simply not true. David Frum wrote a decent book about the 1970s being the decade that was truly transformative, at least on the ground, to most Americans. But the 60s, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. That you can see, if you read Christopher Lasch, you can see America changing, the rise of the experts, from the 1920s or even before, the rise of so-called child-centered parenting, which played a big part in the 1960s. The long hairs with their mustaches and their drug use and their allegedly wild sexual lives were regarded with horror by most people in North America in the 1960s. But I will say this about the so-called new freedoms that the Coen brothers mention in one of their films, that the new freedoms were actually new. So let's take the pill. The pill made it possible for married couples to have unlimited amounts of sex and regulate the number of children that they had, which was seen overwhelmingly to be a good thing. Few imagined at the time what it would lead to, which is the total divorcement of sexual intercourse from procreation. And as I've mentioned before, by 1970, which was about 10 years after the pill came out, the idea of, oh yes, the pill, so I can have sex with my wife forever. What are you, a fascist or something? I have to restrict myself to one woman. Once this was sussed out, that the pill make women infertile forever, if she wanted, that led to a major change in the way that men saw women and later women saw men. Yes, who won the election, presidential election of 1968? Richard Nixon did. And he won it on a law and order platform. Now, it's all very well to say that he just squeaked past Hubert Humphrey, but keep in mind that Hubert Humphrey was a squishy moderate, been ridiculed by LBJ, Hubert Horatio Hornblower, as Jimmy Carter once amusingly, mistakenly called him. But George Wallace, who was even more tough on law and order than Nixon was, won a significant chunk of the vote and took several states. That is to say, the majority of Americans, landslide majority, if you add up Wallace's and Nixon's vote, decided that the 60s had gone too far. Let's talk about civil rights. You may have heard of the Revolution of Rising Expectations. Well, in 1954, the Supreme Court of the United States ruled that separate but equal in classrooms was unconstitutional. They did this not on a legal basis, but on a sociological basis in Brown versus Board of Education. That was certainly revolutionary. 3 years later, the schools of Little Rock, Arkansas, were segregated by force, by paratroopers holding rifles with fixed bayonets. So things seem to be going very much in the way of Black people in the United States. We see in the 1960s a really tremendous, almost universal desire to improve the situation of Black people, which led to legislation and more and more and more legislation giving Black people everywhere in America full civil rights. What did this lead to? It led to burned out cities. That we can track the riots, the Black riots of the 1960s by the legislation, which was intended to ameliorate their condition. And so by 1970, race relations in the United States were arguably much worse than they had been. And then they proceeded to get worse still, and then worse and worse still. Of course, 1969 was the year that America put a man on the moon. And I can tell you there were few people, regardless of their political persuasion, who were not terribly impressed by this. The 1960s was an era of great affluence, not just for the 1%, but for pretty much everybody. After the Second World War ended, it was decided that America owed its citizens a war bonus. And that war bonus resulted in ordinary people, people working in factories, for instance, owning their own homes, owning their own cars, replacing their own cars on a frequent basis, having wives that stayed at home, didn't work, wives that had 3, 4, 5, 6 children. These families would take vacations. So there was a sense in the United States in the 1960s that we can afford everything. Now, of course, another thing that happened in the 1960s was the piling up of debts that would have to be paid off later. An enormous expansion of welfare systems. And the idea was at the time that, oh no, our economy is going to keep going like this, so we don't have to worry about the fixed costs that have now been built into the system. Well, later, decades later, what was it? The era of big government is over, Bill Clinton said. Now, of course, with Joe Biden or whoever's running the United States, we can just print enough money to get out of this. And we can keep doing that and doing that and doing that. Amusingly, LBJ was the last president in living memory to actually run a surplus. Imagine that. That was during the Vietnam War as well. So, as I say, there was a sense that we can have it all. And of course, the movements that were set into motion during the 1960s, feminism, homosexual rights, etc. These are, stochastic in nature. Things begin to fly apart because you see with the identity politics was really invented in the 1960s. And identity politics, of course, leads to the situation that we're in now, that we cannot really assume much loyalty to a national ideal from anyone anymore. One talks about, the silent majority, but, take a look at the boomers and the reliance on Social Security and Medicare. And judging by the commercials that I see on TV, or at least the station that I listen to, these Gibbs are the most important things in their lives, and they will fight tooth and nail to prevent any reduction of them. I suppose it's reasonable enough. These people have paid into the system, and since everyone else is getting more and more Gibbs, then why shouldn't they? But the very idea as Gibbs as necessary to national loyalty is a fairly recent notion. And it's true enough about the 60s people burrowing into the body politic like a horde of maggots, one could say. This is simply true enough. And I suppose that people were surprised later on, I certainly was, when the anti-war people of the 1960s, Bill Clinton is a perfect example of this, became a warmonger. They all became warmongers with few exceptions. And the reason being this: Vietnam wasn't their war. Later, they found wars which were very much their wars. And of course, the 60s people used to laugh at the idea of Vietnamization and that winning hearts and minds and all that. They would joke, oh, winning hearts and minds. Yes, that goes hand in hand, that we had to destroy the village in order to save it, which of course became official U.S. government policy a few decades later, held by both the neoconservatives and the neoliberals. We bomb them because we love them. I think that what makes the 1960s different, and Pollock, of course, touches on this, very much different from where we are today, is that the naivete has really been swept away. Of course, after the George Floyd riots, the George Floyd moment, the racial reckoning, we're back to this idea that if we just give the angry people more stuff and we grovel to them, and grovel as we have never groveled before, then things are going to get better. All evidence indicates that the opposite is true. And of course, in the 1960s, nobody foresaw the oil shocks of 1973 and 1979. And very few people, I mean, libertarianism was considered to be really a lunatic idea by the overwhelming majority of people. And selfishness for its own sake wasn't very popular in the 1960s, but in the late 1970s, and particularly in the 1980s, this idea began to take hold that there are winners and losers in the world. And you people down there, you are the losers, and you have got too big for your boots, and you are living too well. And the natural winners, that is to say, people up here, they deserve more and more and more. And I'm afraid you're just going to have to get used to living more modestly. Those were the before times. And, oh, by the way, beans can be delicious when they're prepared properly. That's where we are now. Let's take a look at the chat. Hello to Quachalango. A warm shower, a thick steak, a good week of work, a good double album, Z-Man show about witches in our lives, and a chance to catch KMG from the top for the first time since his return. Why, thank you for your kind words. Hello to Gamion. Talking about, Taos, New Mexico, Quachalango. I saw that, and whenever I see the name Taos, it reminds me of a hit record. It was only a hit in Canada, and I think in, what was it, 1970, 71? The song was called Taos, New Mexico, and it was, what was this fellow's name? R. Dean Taylor. He had a hit song called Indiana Wants Me. But I don't know, perhaps I'm thinking like this because I've just read American Psycho, which, of course, the pop cultural connections are just endless and exhausting, actually. Who else do we have here? Ann Run, hello. And John S. Emmett Kelly's Earth, William Hicks. William Hicks says, didn't the free speech movement come out of the 1960s? What happened there in the civil rights movement? Seems like today's social justice crowd has forgotten all that. Yes, I suppose you could say that. The free speech movement started at Berkeley in California in, I believe, 1964. But of course, the 1950s had all these famous trials, censorship trials over works which were deemed to be pornographic. And of course, the good guys, that is to say, the people in favor of this, always won. It's instructive to remember that by 1960, that is to say, the end of the 1950s, Playboy magazine already had 1 million subscribers. No sleep till Breezewood, PA says free speech movement was just about permitting communism in college. They dropped it once it was no longer needed. Quachalango says, turns out it was just a play for power. They didn't and don't believe in their professed ideals. Hello to Dionysus. Jogokin666, yo mama. William Hicks says, what I find fascinating is the whole healthcare as a human rights stuff that went right out the door with the COVID-19 lockdowns. Yes, indeed. What did something happen in Antwerp, heart of a real spice trade, while everyone's talking about Dune, says No Sleep? I don't know what that's referring to. Quachalango says, KMG, I get YouTube ads about maritime law. Not sure if because I called you my yacht club captain jokingly once or because I listened to Hornblower novels. Ashley Main Bravo says, is having human rights a human right? Metal Mike says, how do you think they managed to go through the Van Allen radiation belt with 60s technology? I have doubts. Steve says there was briefly a federal budget surplus at the end of the 1990s. I suppose officially, of course, the jiggery-pokery in budgets was already out of control, even as long ago as that. Quachalango says, KMG says, say aleatory instead of stochastic next time, just to keep things random. That's rather good, actually. Ashley Man Bravo says, I'm drinking a Moscow Mule. David Wright says, when the draft ended, so did the anti-war protests. Well, Tom Wolfe points out, and I think he's quite right about this, that it was Kent State and Jackson State in 1970. One was in spring, I guess they were both in spring of 1970. And something like 10, 12, a dozen people died at Kent State. Something like 4 or 5 people died at Jackson State. And as Tom Wolfe concluded, the young people decided that playing at revolution could get you killed. So by the time that the colleges reconvened in September, the anti-war movement was virtually gone. William Hicks says, yeah, didn't the retired set boomers at all when they were younger keep electing politicians who spent everything? This is true. But again, until the oil shock of 1973, the first one, the money was coming in so fast that they actually ran out of ways to spend it. That's why Richard Nixon came up with one of the stupidest and most destructive ideas in American history, which was federal aid to cities. Oh, we've got all this money in the kitty, so why don't we just spend it in this different way? Contra Q says, the boomers and silent generation will get far more money than they ever individually put into the system. Meanwhile, every Gen Y person I talk to doesn't expect these handouts to last. Well, the boomers and the silent generation certainly feathered their nests because of inflation, particularly in housing. You could just sit on your house and just watch it appreciate, and then cash in. With the result that for some years now, when I see houses being sold in Victoria, and sometimes I'll look them up and see how much they cost now, I think, who can possibly afford this? But then I learned from Garth Turner how this works, that essentially their parents use their homes as ATMs to fund the purchase of the younger generation's homes. Is the new Canadian trade minister a woman from China, says Metal Mike? I don't know. Of course, it's impossible to take the Canadian cabinet seriously because there's about 34 or 35 cabinet ministers. And if you look at them, we have a minister of finance, and then we have something else to do with finance, and then something else to do with finance, and we have a minister of infrastructure, and all of these could be consolidated into the United States used to have 12 cabinet ministers. That sounds about right. Indiana wants me. Lord, I can't go back there, says Steve. Yes. More paper doesn't raise the GDP. There'll be lots of paper, nothing to buy with it, says Brandon Smith. Gamian says, I'm living frugally and have 17 years of experience being a vegan. Beans are friends. Okay. Ashley Main Bravo says, Joseph Tainter recently did an interview on RT, Russia Today. Thank you for that. I will look into that because we're going to be reading from Tainter later on, and I'm going to be reading from an essay which cites a Tainter. Young boomers didn't think SS payments would be for them either. It ain't over yet, says David Wright. Moral outrage prophet says odd and even gas days, people sucking in gas, siphoning. I guess that's referring, to the 1970s? I remember that too. Jimmy Carter lowered the speed limit on the interstates to 55, which led to the immortal classic by Sammy Hagar, I Won't Drive 55. And he suggested turning the thermostats down to, I forget what it was, 64, something like that, and suggested that people wear sweaters, for which he was roundly mocked. Who else do we have here? Is this Trudeau's way of signaling to China that all is good? I don't know. When I look at his cabinet, I think it's perhaps a signaling to the Punjab that all is good. British American says they can't keep this going much longer. Opposition to them grows stronger, but wiggle they will to the last breath, for the penalty shall be death. Ashman Bravo says NASA said they are planning on going back to the moon in 2024, but they are now saying they don't have the adequate technology and budget for it. They are going back on their mission. Yeah, well, they made a whole bunch of mistakes. I mean, Eisenhower quite rightly decided that only military men would fly these experimental crafts, because people get upset when civilians get blown up, like Krista McAuliffe, the school teacher who's blowing up, traumatized a generation of school children, or so I've been led to believe. And of course, it has to be diverse, 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 diverse. Diversity is the number one mission of NASA. I guess it was after the Columbia disaster. I joked to Colby Kosh that NASA couldn't fly to Antigua anymore. And he said, oh, they could still fly to Antigua, but the problem would be bringing them back alive. It's not the house going up in value, it's the purchasing power of the currency going down in value, says Brandon Smith. Moral outrage prophet says the draft landed me in Victoria in the womb, LOL. Richard Spencer is representing himself pro C at the Unite at the Right at Charlottesville VA trial, says Ashimin Bravo. I don't think I need to repeat to you the old joke about the man who represents himself in court. Okay, said it earlier, but patient zero of libtard safety based ire was speeders. Then it was smokers, says No Sleep. Let the Wakandans take us to the moon, says David Wright. Nixon's revenue sharing was mostly to the states. LBJ's community action plans tended to be city-oriented, leading to infighting between city mayors and activists, said Emmett Kelly's Earth. I've heard it suggested that that Joe, I think it was by the fellow who runs the American Sun website, that Biden doesn't have to worry about state governors because he'll just send the money directly to the cities, and the cities, of course, all vote for the Democrats. Okay, they say jiggery pokery and true grit. I think Scalia bit it from there. It used to be a common phrase in England. What's the joke about the man representing himself in court? That he has a fool for a client. There aren't enough female black math wizards to reboot the space program, says British American. Okay, so I'm going to be discussing two essays today by a fellow who calls himself Tinksorg. He's half Swedish and he's half African, and I quite like his stuff. He has a piece from the summer, Send Them Back Your Fierce Defiance, Stamp Upon the Cursed Alliance. In recent days, the controversy over the status and future of critical race theory has become acute. Whether left or right, conservative or progressive, one must now have an opinion on it, and most people do. Even the existence of this concept is hotly debated, often in openly disingenuous ways. CRT both does not exist and is a fantasy, and is also not a big deal if and where it is taught, but it is also public good that actually helps all of America. Like Schrodinger's cat, both alive and dead inside the locked box, CRT is at the same time everything and nothing. I've been using this Schrodinger's cat analogy for years now. Of course, these sort of things are often discovered by different people at roughly the same time. It is the name of the beast, a rallying flag for opposition and an enemy strong point to be attacked. It is the name of a conservative fever dream, a rallying flag for defenders of progressive America and a world without racism, and frankly, just plain old common sense that nobody could find fault with. On the right, in particular, the issue of CRT is the source of a number of intellectual and political dilemmas. If the left has one thing going for it, it is that in some broad sense, it wholly supports whatever thing it is we mean by this term. In their case, the problems to be discussed are tactical in nature and have nothing to do with timing, how to present arguments, what areas to stress in order to get parents on board, and so on. For the right, the questions are not just tactical, but strategic. What are we even doing, and why is it that we're doing it? Here one can at least briefly mention the debate surrounding thinkers such as Curtis Yarvin, previously known under his nom de guerre, Mencius Moldbug on the one hand, and the political activism of Christopher Rufo, who has grown into becoming somewhat of a poster child for a new effort at intellectual and political counter-revolution on the other. Perhaps the use of counter-revolution to frame what is taking place today is slightly hyperbolic, but it is at the very least to say that few activists organizing against CRT in schools see these efforts as anything but one smaller part in a much bigger conflict. Critical race theory, like Verdun, is not the name of a conflict, but just one specific and highly iconic bit of frontage that has come to symbolize the nature and spirit of the war being waged. Yarvin's specific and general criticisms of anti-CRT activism deserve to be read on their own, and I shall not make an attempt to really replicate them here. Instead, I will give only the briefest of summaries and hope that, even though truncated, it is not unfair to the author himself. In Yarvin's telling, the fight against CRT is both unlikely to produce the results that conservative thinkers and activists think they will produce, and the biggest reason for this is probably that the enforcers of any laws or rules that conservatives will produce will still belong to a social class that thinks CRT is a good idea. Yes, this is a big problem for people on the right. I don't use this word conservative because it's worse than useless. They all go to the same schools. This is why right-wingers or conservatives, if you will, are continually shocked and appalled by Supreme Court decisions. But John Roberts is our guy. This other fellow here, he was our guy. He was vetted by the Federalist Society. They all go to the same schools. Tingsor continues that the frenetic activity and enthusiasm surrounding this issue belies a fairly complacent conservative nostalgia, a pretense that the America of today is still the same society and thus still has the same social and political capacity for action as the America of yesteryear. Yarvin's critics, and there is no pressing shortage of those, find various things with which to quibble with in his critique, up to and including what is probably the most serious charge of defeatism and counseling inaction. If not this, then what? If not now, when? Here one is reminded of the person who, year in and year out, prays fervently to God to finally let him win the lottery until God, apparently reaching the limits of even divine patience, bluntly tells the petitioner, look, just buy a damn ticket. To many people on the right, the question isn't so much of how to finally hit the jackpot as it is of one of actually mustering the courage to start buying tickets. At a point where conservatives can serve exactly nothing and seem to have no real power over the direction of the society they live in, inaction itself seems just as real of an enemy as any pink-haired college radical. This is obviously a completely insufficient summary of the state of the debate, but what I shall argue below goes in some way beyond what Yarvin's fiercer critiques have to say about the flaws of anti-CRT activism. Ironically, in order to understand exactly why anti-CRT activism has greater potential than to just end up as just another in a long line of quickly forgotten conservative grifts, one first has to lay out all the ways this activism and the ideology behind it is deeply, fundamentally incoherent. In order to get to the truly good, we must first start with the bad, because it is the bad that tells us much that we need to know about how and why American society is so broken. The first point we can make here is that significant parts of anti-CRT activism is incoherent because it is contradictory on the level of practical wants. The point here is not that being against CRT fails to live up to some abstract metaphysical or theoretical standard, and that people should simply read more complicated books to see how and why what they're doing fails to make sense. The point here is rather that even before you open your first book on postmodernism, or figure out how to spell Baudrillard, parts of this project simply fail to fit together at the level of elementary logic. To illustrate this practically, take the concerned parent who wrote an angry open letter to the people running a woke private school in New York, a letter which was then read on Tucker Carlson's show and made the rounds as far away as my native Sweden as an example of a brave person finally standing up to the nonsense capturing our schools. But then he gets to my point here. They all go to the same schools. A few flies ruin this ointment, to say the least. A private school which charges $50,000 a year is not just any kind of school. It is a preparatory school for the elite. Nobody who sends their children to these schools can possibly fail to understand this, nor, one at least hopes, can these parents be ignorant of the fact that the major test a young person faces in order to enter into the American elite is getting into a small set of highly selective, highly prestigious colleges. Beyond any notions of idealism, these schools charge parents very steep fees because the product actually being sold is the maximization of every possible chance and advantage available to get their kids into Harvard. To put things into perspective, getting into Harvard is hard, but not getting in is very easy. Even a rock, which lacks a brain and literally cannot think or act at all, still manages a 100% success rate when set to the task of not getting into Harvard. For humans, there are only a few possible choices and paths in life a person can take in order to have a hope of making it through the eye of the proverbial needle, but an infinite number of choices are available for those who desire to fail. Teaching kids wokeness or CRT or whatever we wish to call it is undeniably a case of these schools doing the job they are paid by the parents to do. If you get into Harvard by being woke, and today it seems that few even on the right would actually deny that you do, the schools that charge $50,000 a year to help kids get into Harvard are going to make those kids woke. And if the parents didn't care about their kids going to Harvard, there are many other uses for $50,000 per annum at a time when the American median income is a mere $36,000 for a working adult. This is the first fundamental incoherence here that one shouldn't breeze past. What is the school actually doing that is wrong, given what the parents want and are willing to pay fantastic amounts of money in order to obtain? It is somewhat akin to being mad at a mechanic for fixing your car, because your car being fixed means you now have to sit in a horrible commute all day. While that may be true, would you be happier if your mechanic took your money and then decided on his own whim to simply not fix your car? Moreover, a mechanic is just a mechanic. Paying him to change the oil on your car does not necessarily imply that he has some special sway over the Department of Transportation. These brave parents standing up to the new crazy ideology invariably seem to be a fairly small minority. The rest of the parents just shrug and accept that if wokeness is what it's going to take for the kids to remain in the elite, then wokeness is what it's going to take. Tinksar continues, this particular incoherence is glaring, but it hides a more substantive complaint. This is the argument that CRT is a bad and harmful ideology that we as a society should seek to eliminate and that our kids should be spared from. But this idea in many ways hides a more serious problem of understanding that the mere fact that some rich people who spend their money on a service then seem to get very mad when they actually get what they pay for. The idea that CRT is bad and harmful initially seems fairly hard to dispute, but look closer and some very real conceptual problems become apparent. In order to really grapple with this issue, with whether CRT is actually good or bad, we do need to lay some cards on the table. Specifically, we need to figure out who we are and what we are looking for. A machine gun is bad as a tool of gardening, but good as a tool for killing people. You having a loaded machine gun pointed at me is good if the perspective of judgment is your ability to shoot me. It is bad if the perspective is one of me trying to avoid getting shot. These sorts of subjective judgments are named such because they require a subject, without which they are quite meaningless. Without actually grounding these judgments in actual subjects and their wants and imperatives, we run the risk of seriously mystifying the stakes, ultimately lying not just to our interlocutors, but also to ourselves. This might seem like sophistry, but in reality, it is anything but. As the private school example above hits at, wokeness in today's America is arguably the primary sorting mechanism for the elite. The purpose of a sorting mechanism is literally to exclude people, but that is far from its only requirement. Lotteries exclude losers as well, but this exclusion is at least supposed to be based purely on chance. Given that elite parents, by and large, want their own kids to remain inside of the elite, a sorting mechanism has to have some accessible way of stacking the deck, where preparation and foreknowledge conspire to help some at the expense of hoi polloi. On the other end of things, a sorting mechanism should not just be a passive yardstick of success or failure, but an active and malleable standard which can be used to actively cull the competition. Being able to cancel people under various pretenses is not so much an antisocial bug in a system of elite selection. It is a necessary and vital feature. Canceling someone is the same as taking them out of the race. Now, I'll just mention, in terms of elite school, you probably have seen in television shows and movies and in books and in nonfiction articles, the agonies that parents go through when they're applying for their children to get into certain preschools. Because it leads from preschool to prep school, and then, to Ivy League or Stanford or MIT. And these parents are basically auditioning before the people who run the school. The fact that you have $50,000 a year or whatever is irrelevant, because there's lots of people, certainly more, they could overfill the schools many times by people who are willing to pay $50,000 a year for their 4 or 5-year-olds to be educated to the extent it's possible to educate a 4 or 5-year-old. The point is, are you the right sort of person? Do you have the right sort of values? Do I like the cut of your jib? It's all very laughable from an educational standpoint, because it has been proven that so-called early learning is useless. All of the gains that are gotten by starting your kid on the academic track at 3, 4, or 5, whatever, they vanish by the time children reach 7. Tingsog continues, in societies where the elite form some sort of warrior caste, the solution to there being too many unlanded sons is to quite literally come up with some way to have those sons kill each other, or at least go somewhere else to be killed, such as by fighting Saracens in the Holy Land. A less martial society may have fewer direct opportunities for getting rid of surplus elites, but that does not mean the problem somehow goes away. The less that is done to deal with surplus elites, the more unruly they will become, and the more direct or indirect ways to alleviate the pressure will be introduced by parents hoping that their own children will make the cut. If there's more chairs than people, a game of musical chairs tends to be a pretty sedate affair. If there's suddenly 20 people in one chair, you can expect things to get pretty rowdy. Now, I don't believe in this essay he deals with the big problem with surplus elites as identified by Peter Turchin, that surplus elites often lead to, civil war. Because if you spent your whole life being assured that you are a member of the elite, you're oh so clever, so intelligent, and then it pans out that, we currently have a waiting list of 100 people to be a barista here at Starbucks. No, but I was going to be an elite. I was educated, I've got my degree, of course, but I've got an MA too, and I'm $130,000 in debt. You've tricked me. When reasonably smart people begin to think in large numbers that society has tricked them, bad things happen. Tinksor continues, this is all to say that most, if not all, of the flaws of wokeness and CRT being lambasted by conservatives aren't really flaws at all. As an example, the notion that CRT is intended to be a form of blood libel against white people becomes somewhat less convincing once you realize that the high priestesses of this new faith is typically an affluent WASP woman, in many cases one who can trace their lineage back to earlier generations of elites. This is not a bug, nor is it even hypocrisy or confusion, but practical ideology. It is certainly not self-hatred. The U.S. currently is in a crisis of elite overproduction, and there are far more contestants than there are seats at prestigious institutions. CRT or wokeness is not the name of some discrete set of ideas or a coherent ideology, as much as it is a language or tool set one can use to compete against other people by means of a form of ritualized social combat. Unlike in the Aztec Empire, the losers of this particular kind of ritual combat do not run the risk of being sacrificed on top of a blood-soaked temple pyramid, but they do risk being marginalized and ultimately excluded from elite competition. The incredible flexibility inherent in this system, where a white elite woman can, without dropping a beat, lecture a black janitor for his internalized racism and lack of moral character, means that the people who win are the ones who are the most ruthless, the most cunning, and most importantly, the ones that have the means to go to private school or hire essay coaches and so on. Officially, skin color matters a great deal, but in real terms, the people that win do so because they are masters of the insanely complicated set of rules, exceptions, and kinks inherent to the language. Yes, so the point here is this really is not so much a question of race, although race is important. It is a question of class. And Americans, and certainly Canadians, have managed to fool themselves that class is not important. Class is exceedingly important. The late Jerry Pournelle, who was a PhD, by the way, pointed out regularly that the elite destroyed the American public education system. Why? Because because they're stupid? No, because they're smart. The public school system in America, when it was good, enabled people who were not in the elite to prosper, and in some cases leapfrog those people whose ancestors had come with the Mayflower or whatever. Similarly, in Britain, the elite destroyed the grammar schools, and it's not just Labour and Shirley Williams. Margaret Thatcher was fully on board with the destruction of grammar schools, even though, strangely enough, she was very much a striver herself, who lived above the shop when she was a child. The grammar school system in Britain allowed working class children who could not possibly afford to go to what they call private schools to prosper, and in many cases leapfrog members of the elite, and the elite did not like that. And the idea that CRT is an ideology fundamentally hostile to white people, as such, has other problems. Possibly the most meaningful systemic change in education taking place right now is a move away from standardized testing, like the Scholastic Aptitude Test, towards more free-form essay formats, where mastery of wokeness is the name of the game. This change disproportionately hurts Asian American students, whose seats are then freed up for other contestants, many of which will be, yes, you guessed it, white. A tool like the SAT, for all of its many flaws, is socially more egalitarian than the essay format. Much like liberals, when faced with the phenomenon of Donald Trump, people on the right today tend to interpret the tenets of CRT literally, but not seriously. To be blunt, if people wanted to be honest about what was going on, they stopped talking about a war on white people and start talking about a war on some white people, waged mostly by other white people. Again, this is an issue of class. While that would certainly be less snappy and make for far more confusing political slogans, it would at least account for the glaring fact that this is a war where both sides are made up of some white people and some minorities, and where the real dividing logic follows class, cultural, geographical, and political lines. Yes, I think this is all very good stuff. And I suppose, you know, I don't know whether they'll be able to get away with this, because the expectations of Black people in the United States have gotten very high indeed. And many of the so-called model minorities are on board with this, that white people must get it in the neck. Of course, the white people who run our societies, they don't really like to think of themselves as white, do they? Many elite Jews come right and say it. Oh, no, we're not white. I don't know. You certainly look white. You look as white as any Italian, and many Spaniards say, or even whiter. No, 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 we're not white. Whereas non-Jewish whites take the line that, oh, no, we're not one of the bad whites. You know, like, we're not one of the bad witches. We're one of the good witches. Well, you know, how could you tell? I mean, if it comes to it, if the revolution comes, no, 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 please don't shoot me. I'm one of the good ones. I'm one of the good ones. You don't look like one of the good ones. Let's see. Back to the essay. The good news here is, at the end of the day, what it is people think they're doing may not actually matter terribly much. Even if the reasoning is incoherent or contradictory, the actions that people end up taking can still do a lot of good in the world. Anti-CRT activism today, like much the CRT itself, may stand to benefit from being taken somewhat more seriously and quite a bit less literally than many are wont to do. In order to take the anti-CRT crowd seriously, perhaps not literally, and sketching out the rough future of American political life in the process, we have to briefly introduce the ideas of an American anthropologist by the name of Joseph Anthony Tainter. Tainter's best-known work is called The Collapse of Complex Societies, and it is a work that gives us a useful model for conceptualizing some of the practical problems surrounding modern CRT and its role as an elite selection mechanism. Tainter's basic argument is that humans always tend towards a one-way approach to solving problems they encounter in life, by adding complexity. To illustrate this, the most basic, but certainly not the easiest way to hunt an animal requires no tools or weapons at all. Utilizing the fact that we as a species sweat and are incredibly long-distance runners, humans can actually hunt gazelles by simply chasing one particular animal doggedly over a period of days until the animal eventually collapses from exhaustion. At that point, all one has to do is find a nearby rock or heavy branch and club the tired animal to death. This method of hunting is obviously pretty demanding, so over the millennia, we've come up with many tools to make hunting safer, easier, and more painless. Every new tool tends to be more complex than the last. A Neolithic bow is not very complex compared to a modern hunting rifle, in turn requiring more and more time and resources in order to function, but rewarding us with greater comfort and capability for the end user. Almost without fail, when human societies encounter new problems, they try to solve them by means of some new invention or social process that adds to the total level of complexity of that society. This is not bad in and of itself. We wouldn't be doing this if complexity didn't genuinely solve real problems, but there are certain limits to this. First limit, it's inescapable. Complexity tends to allow for efficiency. Indeed, that is one of the reasons we love it so much. An efficient system is by definition not a robust system that tolerates shocks well. A just-in-time logistics system illustrates this principle perfectly. If everything is just in time, then any disruption to circulation means that the entire system seizes up. If you have a lot of spare parts lying around in case something goes wrong, you're actually not even using a just-in-time system. The second limit is somewhat more subtle, but over time it becomes equally intractable. Complexity has diminishing returns. Put another way, the cost of complexity can grow linearly or even exponentially all the way up to infinity, but the added benefit invariably decreases over time. To illustrate this, take the concept of the Internet of Things. This once popular Silicon Valley meme is increasingly hard to take seriously today, but even looking at it during its heyday, consider what it actually promised to deliver humanity. Instead of an ordinary fridge, you'd have a new smart fridge that could then send you notifications to buy milk next time you visited the grocery store. And realistically, said fridge would then sell all your personal data to the highest bidder. When I was first introduced 3-4 years ago, the Internet of Things is coming, and we're going to need 5G for that. Okay, so we're going to need 5G, and what stupendous innovation can we look forward to? Your fridge is going to spy on you. All the devices in your house are going to spy on you. And I thought, why would I want that? Why would anyone want that? Tinksor continues, it is very easy to imagine such a smart fridge costing almost twice as much and being almost twice as complex as an ordinary fridge from the 90s. It is another thing entirely to imagine that you would be getting double the perceived usefulness out of it. For most people, keeping your food cold is more or less what a fridge is supposed to do, and here new fridges offer no benefit over old ones. Whatever added advantage one gets from slapping an AI, a bunch of sophisticated optical sensors, and an internet connection to a fridge is likely to fall very short of the added costs and very real drawbacks of doing so. When societies start running into real regime-level crises is when their preferred method of solving a problem, making things more complex and more centralized, end up actually making problems worse rather than better through a combination of increased fragility and diminishing returns. Societies that run into this dilemma rarely decide to voluntarily go in the other direction and reduce complexity while they can still safely do so. The social reality inside any society is that nobody wants to be the one that loses out. Complexity is therefore retained even when it starts doing more harm than good, and even past the point where the system itself starts breaking down. The go-to solution to new problems will still be to add new physical and social technologies, in spite of the fact that they stopped being affordable a long time ago. Well, I don't know. Is multiculturalism affordable? We seem to be reaching the limits, or we'll soon have an answer to this question. It was something like 30 years ago that Oberon pointed out with regard to this term political correctness, which was a term that everyone was learning at the same time, and they seemed to regard it as a joke. And he pointed out that it is not a joke. It is a system designed to prevent multicultural societies to devolving to the point where everyone is killing each other. So, there was a way to avoid the need for PC, for multiculturalism, for enforced diversity and inclusion. Certainly in Canada and in Britain and France, the United States is something of a special case. Don't bring in large numbers of foreigners who are not like us. But no, that was not considered. Let's bring in the foreigners with all of the problems, economic, social, attendant with them. But no, we've created this new system now called PC or multiculturalism, diversity, whatever you want to call it. But it doesn't seem to be working. So what's the answer? We need more and more and more and more. One gets the impression that in the University of California system, that soon they will have more diversity administrators than actual professors. I think they're moving towards that pretty quickly. The most central aspect of CRT and mutatis mutandis, the entire political movement we're living through, is deeply connected to this dynamic. If one accepts Turchin's thesis of elite overproduction as pointing to something real, and elite competition is one of the driving causes of political and social instability in the United States, then one should also acknowledge that the elite's preferred solution to this crisis of overproduction is a haphazard, desperate, and wildly unpopular turn towards centralization and increased complexity at almost any cost. The evidence for this claim is at times clear enough to be almost farcical. At the time of writing this, President Biden recently tweeted that as a part of his Build Back Better plan, all Americans should be given access to 4 more years of extra schooling at the state's expense, 2 years of preschool and 2 years of community college. The American educational system is already fundamentally broken in very deep, serious ways, and figuring that adding even more of it will somehow change things is truly grasping at straws. Well, yes, educational system is a perfect example of the problems of complexity. So let's see, public education is not all that old in North America. How old? 100 mandatory, 120 years, maybe a little longer. We associate this, with the theories of John Dewey. When it was only a small number of people who were actually being formally educated, there wasn't much complexity in the system. But now everyone has to go to school. It's the law. but people used to be able to drop out when they were 14 or 15. No, we can't have that. So we're going to make people go all the way to 17 or 18. And what about those people who are just not up to it? Well, we'll pass them anyway. But then high school education wasn't sufficient. It used to be a tiny minority that went to colleges or universities. That's not acceptable. This is a human right. Everyone should go to college or university, which of course makes the system incredibly complicated. And of course, the solution to the buckling of the system under the weight of all of the people who should not be involved in it, of course, is more education. And so, yes, what is the answer for conservatism, or the right, as I prefer to call it? Well, I think it involves stepping back from looking at symptoms and beginning to address causes such as the cult of choice, the cult of education is another one. The cult of scale, bigger is always better. And he concludes, if Oswald Spengler once proclaimed that optimism was cowardice, today one might add that pessimism can perhaps lead one astray as well. If all likelihood a blue Caesar, to borrow a term from Michael Anton, will never appear in today's America, the original Caesar emerged at a point where the Roman state, as such, still had a lot of gas in the tank, and more specifically, the Romans had much room left to grow in both complexity and scale. By shedding its outdated social order, Rome could focus all of its ample energies into building a social and military machine whose efficiency had never been seen before and which has only rarely been matched since. Complexity for the Romans did not appear as a problem to be solved, but a force for good that only needed to be harnessed and put to use. Augustus found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. He did not find Rome suffocating under the weight of multiplying potholes, collapsing bridges, and crumbling infrastructure across the board. I'll just say to wrap up my discussion of this essay that I think rather than Caesarism, what James Burnham called Bonapartism is more to the point. If you look at the point where Napoleon Bonaparte took over France shortly to become emperor, well, Caesar, kind of Caesar, same word. France had, of course, it reached a low point, which led to the Estates General, which led quickly to a revolution, which led to terror and genocide, and then war with the whole of Europe, it seemed. And then Napoleon shows up, and guess what? The tide turns, because Napoleon was a man that Frenchmen could rally behind. Of course, the diehard monarchists were not going to rally behind him, but there were certainly enough people, a solid majority of people, who were prepared to believe that Bonaparte was their future. So let's go back to the chat. Thermidor now, Sachokakin 666. Okay, I'm gonna have to scroll up a bit. Ashiman Bravo says, apparently the Lincoln Project hired some Democratic operatives in MAGA hats and tiki torches in front of the Republican campaign for Virginia governor's campaign bus. I knew about the second part, but if if the Lincoln Project is involved here, that is one of the sweetest win-wins I have come across for quite some time. Okay. Wow, we got a lot of comments here. Of course, I haven't been back to the chat for a while. Evil Appliances of the Beast, says Laramie Hirsch. Hello. Haven't heard from you in a while. Chokakin 666 says, I read the California ports will not allow non-union truckers to enter the ports, and self-owner operators don't have a union. Asherman Bravo says, is it cringe when Republican candidates for Congress run ads in pickup trucks, cowboy hats, wielding guns, and saying they will defend the Constitution and freedom? You know, we had a similar thing in the province of Alberta, which is supposed to be Canada's redneck province, but it's not for a long time. When Jason Kenney, when he was running for the leadership of the new United Conservative Party, he drove around Alberta in a pickup truck wearing exactly the opposite of the kind of clothes that Jason Kenney would actually wear in real life. And I know this about Jason Kenney because I once knew him quite well. And it's not like he's, you know, that he decided to embrace his inner redneck. There was anything close to an inner redneck in Jason Kenney. This is a fellow who, for enjoyment, likes to listen to chant music, monophonic music sung by monks from the Middle Ages. And the type that he likes to listen to is not the popular type from the French and German monks. It's more obscure than that, even. Professor Pohl says, us academics never made enough to learn how to drive and buy a car. Well, Professor Crunk makes $122,000 a year teaching for Rutgers, and that doesn't include, you know, what she gets paid for television appearances and for her books and essays. Whatever happened to Joe the Plumber, who went viral during Obama's 2008 presidential run? Says Asherman Bravo. I don't know. It's a good question. What else do we have here? Asherman Bravo says those Republican candidates invariably state that if elected, they will go to Washington and drain the swamp. Where have we heard that before? Ronald Reagan. Okay? The Reagan Revolution. I remember it very well. I was fully invested that these people, they were going to go to Washington, a city which they hated, even if they'd never been there, and they were going to drain the swamp. They were going to be like Hercules. You know, they were going to clean out the Augean stables. And once these great tasks had been achieved, they were all going to go home, you know, secure, happy in the knowledge that America could in some way go back to what it used to be. Well, the people who went there were people who had been obsessed with politics from very early age. And they showed up in Washington and they discovered, oh my God, that's all they do here is politics. That's all they talk about here is politics. And I can sign on, I can become a professional conservative, and that's going to be my livelihood until I retire. And so they never left. They never left. Okay. Joe Legati apparently is starting a podcast, 50-50 on whether he'll be based or cringe, says no sleep. Republican candidates for Congress posting their L's, says Asherman Bravo. Laramie Hirsch says bring in foreigners and destroy the people and the legacy of those who built our system. No Sleep says self-driving cars will fail because they could only work on 100% automated roads. It strikes me that Americans, or most Americans, actually like driving. One, so they wouldn't want to give this up. And two, they don't trust. I mean, it's one thing to have an automated subway system, as, say, Vancouver does, which they came about with this because they wanted basically not to involve the union. And it's worked. They've never had a fatality or even a serious accident. I believe it started in 1986. But the idea of tens of millions of autonomous units on the roads at all time, yeah, I mean, what's the worst that could happen? Let's see. Professor Pohl says they do have more administrators than faculty at the University of California, Campi. Oh, well, thank you for the confirmation. Contra Coup says the push by social engineers away from meat consumption could be interpreted in this way as a ploy to weaken and mollify the public, having nothing to do with the environment. Mollify the public. Legalizing drugs, it seems to me to be a move to mollify the public, or that part of the public that uses drugs or would use drugs if it were legal, or if they were legal. I don't know, people, the hamburgers that are made by McDonald's and Burger King, apparently they're full of plastic, but people, oh, this is meat. I'm eating meat. I'm eating beef. So, in a way, I'm kind of a king because I can eat beef every day. I know that Burger King, for one, sells these grass burgers now, and but I just don't think that has the same effect, and I don't think it's ever going to have the same effect. Yo Mama says, I think you could still drop out at 16 in Ohio. Jim Smith says, how about eliminating public education? Well, I suppose the rot has set in by the time that people graduate from high school. But to my mind, 5% of the population is tops for university. And I'm not talking about trade schools. Of course, universities incorporate many departments which properly belong in trade schools. Oh, I don't know, nursing would be one. But no, 5%. And I think they should have the full board paid. Now, there are obviously problems to work out. The SWATs, the strivers, and I could mention one particular ethnic group or one particular region of the world would seek 100% of those slots. But something could be worked out. Ashimane Bravo says maybe the globalist elite like Bill Gates and Klaus Schwab need to go. Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to repeat that. I think it would get me into trouble. Laramie Hirsch says ingratiate oneself into a local gray economy and detach from mainstream society as much as possible. Mainstream, well, in certain regions, normal people could be mainstream. People who say self-driving cars are impossible sound a lot like those who erroneously said that computers would never play chess, says Contraku. I don't know that anyone ever said the Russians were heavily into computer chess going back to the 1950s. Mikhail Botvinnik, who was one of the greatest chess players ever, was heavily invested in this. And the problem was that that they didn't understand then increased computing power, Moore's law, and heuristic systems. They looked at a brute force approach. And given how complex chess is, the great minds like Botvinnik came to the conclusion that chess, well, it was possible with computers, they'd never beat people because a brute force approach would not avail. So let's go to Jim Kunstler, whose column today is called You Know What They're Saying. Do you marvel, as I do, at this malignant hive organism, arguably worse than the COVID-19 chimera virus, that calls itself Joe Biden? The personage of that name is a mere effigy, of course, like one of those grotesque mummies hoisted above the mob in a religious procession from some primitive cannibal kingdom. It's the mob itself that actually matters, though, the twerking parade of woke progressive Democrats, because it is bent absolutely on rooting out, punishing, and torturing its perceived enemies, which in this case are about half the people in America. That's really all it seeks to do. It has never been about anything else because, get this, the woke mob is insane. But now this other half of the country has raised a war cry. Let's go Brandon in objection. In case anyone does not know what the phrase means, peruse the actual lyrics, which I won't repeat because I'm sure you're knowing them, or you know them rather. Is that too subtle for anyone? Do you catch the drift? Know what they're saying? The sentiment is timelier and apparently more popular than I Want to Hold Your Hand was in 1963. America has had enough of the woke religious cult and its cavalcade of depravities. America is about to bum rush the darn thing, seize the ghastly mummy from its skull-bedecked palanquin, and knock the living sawdust out of it. Doings in the Loudoun County, Virginia school board lately became the rectified essence of the wild, irresponsible, woke derangement overtaking the land. Now, I was very grateful for this paragraph because the stories that I'd read about the complaints didn't go into the detail necessary. This is a problem with journalism, that if you go into woke depravity in detail, Many people will say, and I've run into this problem as a journalist myself, many people will say, that's ridiculous, you made that up. Whereas other people will say, this is disgusting, I'm not reading your publication anymore, I don't want this filth in my house. But here we go. The board authorized a sex education booklet that instructed teenage boys how to perform oral sex on each other, with explicit illustrations of one boy on his knees servicing another boy standing, while the board backed the sowing of maximum gender confusion among high schoolers who, under the best conditions, have a tough time adjusting to the hormonal storms of adolescence, all in the name of promoting a woke brownie point collecting exercise called Pride Week. And guess what? The parents of Loudoun County began to object to this meshuggahs, and then the school board proceeded to squash and evade their objections, and even enlisted that degenerate troll, Attorney General Merrick Garland, to intimidate objecting parents with the FBI and federal writs against so-called domestic terrorism. For his trouble, Garland was unmasked as a prevaricating tool in the U.S. Senate hearing this week, nicely captured by the TV cameras so the citizenry could see him in weaselly operation. It also came out that twice this fall, a teenage boy wearing a skirt, ostensibly gender confused in exactly the way promoted by the school board, committed 2 rapes of teenage girls in the girls' bathrooms of 2 Loudoun County schools, to which he was granted as someone pretending to bethink himself a girl, though it turned out he knew quite well how to deploy his male generative organ. The crimes were reported to the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office and shared with the county school superintendent, who covered it up. Not a smooth move as things turned out, because now the country can see exactly how criminally dishonest the wokesters are. And as all this rolled out, woke progressive Democratic candidate for governor of Virginia, Terry McAuliffe, made the supernaturally doltish utterance that, quote, parents shouldn't tell schools what to teach, unquote. His campaign even put out roadside signs under his name repeating the statement of principle. In case anyone missed it, the result, McAuliffe dropped about 8 points almost overnight in the polls. The voters are about to pop him out of the political universe like a watermelon seed between their fingers. But wait, this just in, NBC News is reporting that the results of the gubernatorial race in Virginia might not be known on election night. And we all know what that means, don't we, folks? Meanwhile, the mummy known as Joe Biden has ventured abroad, first to Rome to be feted, his handlers thought by the Pope. But His Excellency Pope Francis ordered the TV cameras turned off, apparently unwilling to be seen consorting with the inanimate, disintegrating, graven image of a U.S. president. Meanwhile, the stage managers back at the White House, Chief of Staff Ron Klain and Susan Rice, shadowy director of the Domestic Policy Council, floated an initiative to give $500,000 to each family member of children and parents who had gotten separated while attempting to enter the U.S. illegally. That ought to warm the hearts of U.S. citizens thrown out of their jobs and their livelihoods for demurring to take a vaccine. And he has something to say about this, which I cannot repeat. Now cue the mother of all migrant caravans marching north to the wide-open U.S.-Mexican border because Joe Biden wants it that way. Just what millions of broke, thrown out of work, soon to freeze and starve U.S. citizens will be treated to watch on their flat screens before the cable service is switched off for non-payment. Joe Biden just wants to rub their faces in it, or rather the folks behind him pulling his strings want to do that. Maybe the time has come to cut Joe Biden's strings, and just maybe it's time to put an end to the woke march through our history. And maybe I'll leave this for Monday, a more recent essay by Tink Zorg called Welcome to Jurassic Park, and it really has to do with the collapse of complex societies. Yes, I will do that. And apparently there's some smart people running the Republican campaign in Virginia. This is from the Virginia Star. Will your daughter be next? Brutal ad targets McAuliffe after alleged Loudoun County rape cover-up. An ad launched by the America's Principles Project. Okay, I guess that's not the GOP. which describes itself as the premier national organization engaged directly in campaigns and advocacy on behalf of the family, blasts Democrat gubernatorial candidate Terry McAuliffe in connection with the rape of a girl in Loudoun County. The ad says, in Loudoun County, Virginia, a 15-year-old girl was brutally raped by a male student wearing a dress in the girl's bathroom. Democrats covered it up. A few weeks later, the same male student raped a 14-year-old girl. Terry McAuliffe won't protect our daughters in their most private spaces. Democrats say this would be transphobic. Will your daughter be next? Yeah, that's the kind of advertising that I like. The kind of advertising that's actually, effective. Just how depraved are America's public schools? And I have no doubt that Canada's public schools are just as bad, if not worse. This is from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. The Kentucky high school principal, currently under fire for photos which show him enjoying lap dances performed by students, was also fondled by another student during a drag queen show. Donald Mobilini, the principal of Hazard High School, a Freudian name there, is already under investigation after images were posted of a 2019 school event described as a man pageant, during which girls dressed as Hooters waitresses and boys in lingerie pranced around performing sexually suggestive dance moves. Mobilini can be seen smiling in the pictures, apparently very much enjoying the show. Matt Jones had tweeted, Hazard High School holds man pageant that leads to male students dressed in Hooters outfits and bikinis giving teachers lap dances, and pictures were shared by the school. Yes, let's put that in the yearbook. Let's see, Watson continues. Now it's emerged that a similar show took place the following year with Mobilini once again appearing to have fun. The footage, which was shot during the same event in 2020, sees a student wearing a long white dress at one point dancing and getting up close and personal with Donald Happy Mobilini, reports the Daily Mail. The student can be seen provocatively walking towards the head of the school before running his hands over the principal's head and kissing him on the cheek. Oh, like a virgin is playing in the background. Yes, how about that? Meanwhile, parents are being treated as terrorists by the FBI for having concerns about what's happening inside schools. Homeschool your kids, folks. Yes, I was listening to Norm Macdonald the other day, and he said this several times, that he thinks that he pointed out that not all Catholic priests are pederasts. And that, in his opinion, an opinion I share, there are far more children molested by teachers than are molested by priests. And this has been true for a very long time. I mean, when one looks at the type of people that become teachers, Yves Lenoir wrote in his autobiography, A Little Learning, about his schoolmasters. Of course, the students were all boys and the masters were all men. That some of them liked boys too little and others liked boys too much. This story is from Breitbart. It's another school atrocity. By Nick Gilbertson. A Florida school board member reportedly accompanied elementary school students on a field trip to a gay bar. I am so honored to be invited to chaperone Wilton Manor's Elementary's field trip to the incredible Rosies, Broward County School Board member Sarah Leonardi wrote in a Facebook post. The students and I had a fun walkover and learned a lot about our community. A huge thank you to Rosie's Bar and Grill for hosting this special field trip every year. Yeah. And my, let's talk about the falling apart of America. Apparently we have some polling data on this. This is from Paul Bedard at the Washington Examiner. So much for the happy unity President Joe Biden promised in his inaugural address just 283 days ago, because according to Washington's top Democratic pollster, the nation's mood is best described with words and phrases including mass depression, frayed, pessimistic, and dejected. Said Celinda Lake, quote, Americans' views on division in this country reflect a kind of mass depression at the ever-growing rifts that have come to define our new normal, unquote. She has worked with the Clintons, the DNC, Nancy Pelosi. She wrote a memo detailing the results of the latest landmark Georgetown University politics, battleground, and civility poll. She pointed out that despite Biden's efforts, most see the nation near civil war, families divided over politics, and many fearful that the American dream is soon to be out of reach. Her 12-page memo is especially insightful because it is written from the perspective of a strong supporter of Biden and Democrats, and one who has hoped that the president can unify the country, push through a major social agenda, and show that partisanship works. The results of the survey show a different story. And Biden has lost an enormous amount of support. Lake noted in her analysis, civility is strained in the days since President Donald Trump left office, and Biden has failed to break bread with Republicans. No, he's declared war on everyone who voted for Trump. For example, she noted that some friends and families have struggled with politics, while most Americans, 79%, say they have friends that have different political views than their own, and alarmingly high 19% say they don't. And among families, an alarmingly high 26% of Americans have family members with whom they are no longer able to talk to because of their views about politics and current events. Many voters believe Biden is making a good faith effort to restore unity and civility in America, but the intensity behind these views is middling, and they have dropped since June. Currently, 17% of voters think Biden has worked extremely hard to restore unity and civility, 16% that he has worked very hard, 21% that he's worked somewhat hard, and 44% say that he has not worked hard at all. Okay. Yes, fight the real enemy. That's my position. And who are the real enemy? Again, to repeat, this is not so much a racial issue or ethnic issue as it is a class issue. Here's another example, again from Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News. Details of AT&T Corporation's racial re-education program has leaked, in which the company asserts, quote, American racism is a uniquely white trait, unquote, and announces, quote, white people, you're the problem, unquote. The documents were obtained by Christopher Rufo. CEO John Stankey launched the program last year and subsequently has told employees that private corporations such as AT&T have an obligation to engage on the issue of racial injustice and push for systemic reforms in police departments across the country. According to a senior employee who agreed to speak on a condition of anonymity, managers at AT&T are now assessed annually on diversity issues with mandatory participation in programs such as discussion groups, book clubs, mentorship programs, and race re-education exercises. White employees are mandated to confess their systemic racism and enjoyment of white privilege or face penalties. They're so privileged they get to enjoy one of America's biggest corporations openly discriminating against them for their skin color. Well, my reaction is the same, and I urge this upon you. When you hear people more powerful and richer than you with a job that you might like yourself, simply say to them, I think that if you were sincere, you would today resign your position and insist that it be filled by a person of color, preferably a woman, and preferably non-binary. Because I think that if you're not willing to make this small sacrifice for D, I, and E, then you're just a hypocrite. And what answer could they have to that? Because it doesn't matter that they're allies. All white people are inherently racist, and there's nothing they can do about it. This is what they are teaching people. So, Saul Alinsky said, we have to make them live by their own rules. Yes, this is from AP. Communities across the United States are reconsidering their approach to gifted and talented programs in schools as vocal parents blame such elite programs for worsening racial segregation and inequities in the country's education system. A plan announced by New York City's mayor to phase out elementary school gifted and talented programs in the country's largest school district, if it proceeds, would be among the most significant developments yet in a push that extends from Boston to Seattle. Yes, apparently there are still some pockets in the United States where children can get a decent education. They must be destroyed. And this push is leading to a new racial problem, or a more exacerbated racial problem: blacks versus Chinese. I read about a protest in New York City a couple of months ago, and it was really quite revealing of America's future, or one aspect of America's future, that there were black people there saying racist, 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 and there were a lot of Chinese people there, and one Chinese man was particularly exercised, and he said, "You people used to blame the whites. Now you are blaming the Chinese. Why don't you study harder?" Which I thought was pretty funny. And, okay, we're going to book club soon. And I don't want to talk about Canadian. Oh, I'm going to have to mention this because it's just so outrageous. This is from Laura Chapin at the CBC, making the case to raise the Canadian flag so it can be lowered on Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day, it's Armed Services Day or Veterans Day in the United States, November the 11th, to commemorate the end of World War I. It has effectively become Canada's national holiday. Canada Day, generic national holiday, which is a celebration of immigrants, and so Remembrance Day must be destroyed as well. Flags at federal sites have remained at half-staff amid discoveries at former residential schools. Yes, every federal institution in my country, which there are many thousands, the Canadian flag has been at half-staff since the end of May. And Trudeau has been asked, when is this going to end? To be determined. When the Indians say it's okay. Yeah, that's how this ridiculous country is run now. And of course, the Canadian Legion, which was known as one of the most patriotic organizations in Canada, not so much anymore, particularly after they kicked Don Cherry to the curb, who had been one of its, for decades, been one of its greatest fundraisers. This is from Canadian Press. The Royal Canadian Legion says it plans to raise the flag at the National War Memorial in Ottawa before the Remembrance Day ceremony, and then lower it again to half-staff. I think that's enough Canadian news. And let's see, what do we have? Oh, yes, an interesting piece from the Gatestone Institute about Zuckerberg and the 2020 election. Not just Zuckerberg, but I think I'll get to that on Monday. There's a story from the Western Journal by Jack Gist. Leftists talk about unity and routinely sow seeds of discontent. It's a habit they don't want to break. They want no peace. Former President Barack Obama and rocker Bruce Springsteen casually fell into the habit in a recent interview on CBS. In the interview, Obama said, in an ideal world where Bruce and Clarence portrayed on stage was essentially a reconciliation, right, and redemption. But most of your audiences were primarily white, and they love Clarence when he's on stage. But if they ran into him to a bar, suddenly the N-word comes out. Springsteen's reply was a nod of the head and yeah, as if most of his fans were vile racists. I don't know, they would recognize him in a bar and they would still use the N-word. Bruce Springsteen's audiences have been pretty woke for quite some time now. Ever since what? Nebraska? I guess it was. But look at Barack Obama. Barack Obama is, well, half black. But Barack Obama, his mother, his grandmother, very close ties to the CIA. And of course, Barack Obama was one of those people who got tipped for the top. He's been a member of the elite for a long time. And you remember when he was running for president and he lamented at a fundraiser of all places, these vile Americans who insist on clinging to their guns and Bibles. He hates Americans. Obama is not an American. He's not. He was born in Hawaii, which is not America. He was raised in Hawaii and in Indonesia, and as far as I know, did not set foot in the continental United States until he was 18 years old. Not an American. Just, in terms of fighting the real enemy, an interesting column by Darvio Moro, CEO of the FCB radio network, in Newsweek magazine. Media elites are using black people to excuse their class bigotry. We need to talk about class bigotry, he begins. Indeed, we do. One of the most salient facts of American life today is how disconnected the power structure is from the average citizen, and the vicious cycle it feeds on itself. America's elites, including its liberal elite, live in their own neighborhoods, come from similar backgrounds, go to the same schools, and can go from cradle to grave, never having a meaningful experience with the people who come from where I come from. I'm from inner city Cleveland. I grew up in poverty. My story will be familiar to many across the country, just as it will be foreign to members of the American elite. When my mother's job at General Motors disappeared, we went from solidly middle class to poor overnight. My parents struggled to send me to private schools, paying out of pocket because they made $100 over the limit to qualify for vouchers. When we were being told that we made too much money for a school voucher, the electric and gas companies gave us disconnection notices. My educational experience was unique. Going from a private school environment back to an inner city reality was jarring at times. But one thing I learned during that experience was how much I have in common with people who don't look like me. My elementary school was predominantly white, and while most of my classmates had more money than I did, it wasn't by much. They were from working class and middle class families with similar struggles to ours. My white classmates dealt with similar issues in environments not that different from my own. Think about it. The Pew Research Center found that just 29% of African Americans self-identify as liberal, 65% define themselves as conservative or moderate. But is that what you see from the average black pundit, or do you see the extremes dominating the conversation with little regard for the views of regular black people? The more time I spend in elite circles, the less comfortable I am with the way they treat people like me. When they believe that you're good enough to be in the room, they show you how they really feel about the ones who aren't there. It's class bigotry, pure and simple, and it goes from annoying to problematic when one realizes that these are the people making cultural and political decisions for everybody else. Donald Trump enjoyed a really significant increase in black support in the last election. Of course, there was some groveling, involved Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, but I think the real reason was that Trump, he electioneered as a populist, not, the whole Jack Kemp approach. It has always been a loser, enterprise zones and the like. No. Trump spoke to them as someone who had personal experience in giving people jobs. And which meant that he was more popular than his predecessors had been. I'm rather suspicious when I see polls that say, the vast majority of black Americans are, conservative. I mean, conservative or moderate, whatever that might mean these days. But, the elite has white pets. Like the amusingly named Ibram X. Kendi and Professor Crunk and N. Hannah Jones and Oprah's special friend who's on CBS. But you see, since Ferguson, the murder rate in America has risen significantly. And most of those people getting killed, usually over trifles, are black people. Does the elite care about this? No, I don't want to go DR3 on you, but the elite doesn't care. The elite, in a way, is pleased about this because they can point to the increase in murders. Oh, no, we need more diversity, inclusion, et cetera, more die. And white people, the bad white people, need to get down on their knees and beg for forgiveness. I'm not going to do that because I'm one of the good white people, So again, it's a question of knowing who the real enemy is. And okay, so well, did very, very briefly. The increasingly senile Joe Biden was at the Vatican, where during an audience with the Pope, or at least the public part of it, interesting to note that his wife, Dr. Jill, was wearing a mantilla. I wonder if she wears a mantilla when she goes to Mass in Washington. I rather doubt it. Anyway, so this guy, he looks like he's going to fall apart, Joe Biden. I mean, his skin is just going to fall off his body, you know. It's going to be like eyes without a face. So he decides that the Pope would be interested in a story about Satchel Paige. Why he thought the Pope would be interested in this story is an interesting question. But he told a largely incoherent story about Satchel Paige pitching to win, he said, whether he meant that to say that Satchel Paige had actually won this game, but pitching to win on his 47th birthday. Well, there's very few things that happened in the history of baseball which can't be looked up, and I did look it up. And Satchel Paige was not the starting pitcher for the St. Louis Browns on his 47th birthday. Satchel Paige was undoubtedly a good baseball player, perhaps a great baseball player. But the difficulty was because Negroes, as they were then called, were not allowed into Major League Baseball. We don't know how he would have competed against the greatest players of the time in his heyday. I mean, much is made of his success when he was finally allowed into Major League Baseball, and I wanted to try to quantify this, and I found out that I'd forgotten this, that Major League Baseball now considers all the statistics from the various Negro leagues to be just as good as the ones from Major League Baseball. So if you want to find out, how good Satchel Paige was just in his Major League Baseball years, you're going to have some difficulty. But of course, Satchel Paige was not he's sometimes talked about as the only baseball player who pitched into his 40s, and that's simply not true. Jamie Moyer, having an incredible season as of 2012. This is from Bill James Online. Charlie Huff, Nolan Ryan was pretty spectacular in his 40s. Randy Johnson, Gaylord Perry, Warren Spahn, Tommy John, of course, the great Cy Young, Tim Wakefield, Jimmy Catt, and there are others, Greg Maddux, David Wells. So, I don't want to say anything bad about Satchel Paige at all. It's just that there's an attempt here to, make him be considered a greater pitcher than, Grover Cleveland Alexander or, Cy Young or, whoever you choose. And it's simply not true. We don't have the evidence of it. If baseball was by far the most popular sport in America during Satchel Paige's day, and if America is 90% white and 10% black, that means that the pool of good players in Major League Baseball at the time, the segregated Major League Baseball, was going to be of much higher quality than the pool in the Negro leagues. Leaving apart from the fact that many of these Negro leagues were very fly-by-night operations. I mean, a little different from barnstorming. But that's enough about baseball, because a little late, I'm going to move on to the book club, and I'm going to be discussing, I suppose, one of the most scandalous novels ever written in America, and it is by Bret Easton Ellis, and it is called American Psycho. Bret Easton Ellis, golly, that's like the waspiest name ever, isn't it? He was born in 1964. His first novel came out in 1985. It was called Less Than Zero. And a film was made of that. Films have been made of quite a few Ellis novels. I've seen the film Less Than Zero. It stars Robert Downey Jr. I think it is tremendously underrated. It's a pretty Baudelaireized version of the novel. That is to say, is typical with Ellis's novels. There's much in it which is disgusting, and most of that has been eliminated from the movie, although it is, to put it least, a movie which involves its main character being forced into homosexual prostitution in order to pay off a debt. That's pretty tawdry. Wouldn't you admit? Bret Easton Ellis, he was very coy about his sexuality for quite a long time. Whenever you hear, here's a tip, you probably figured this out. Whenever you hear a person say, well, I don't fall in love with someone's genitals, I fall in love with a person, that person's homosexual. Okay? Whenever a person says, oh, I don't want to define my sexuality, that person is homosexual. And so is Ellis. Of course, he's hated by many people in the alphabet people community because he's seen to be a self-hating gay. He's a very funny man, actually. He was once dragooned into taking part of one of these it gets better things. And at one point he said, can we have a reality check here? It gets worse. And he once commented about the TV show Glee, that watching it was like stepping into a puddle of AIDS. Okay, so what is this novel about? Well, it's about the Wall Street go-go years, It was published in 1991, so it was written in the 1980s, and there are several references to Ronald Reagan being on TV. So, of course, Reagan stopped being president in January 1989. So let's just say it's late 80s. You remember the late 80s, don't you? Suspenders, slicked back hair, padded shoulders, yellow power ties, a culture of excess. That's what this book is about. To the extent that it is a realistic portrayal of Wall Street in the 1980s, I suppose is open to question, but Ellis has certainly done his research. No question about that. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of research done for this book. And it's about Patrick Bateman is our anti-hero. He's called the All-American Boy several times because he seems he's with a crowd of other Wall Street go-go boys, and they all seem in various ways to be worse than him, or to be very nasty or disgusting. Whereas Bateman dials it back somewhat. Of course, one of the jokes in the novel is that right from the very beginning, we learn that Bateman has an obsession with serial killers, which is typically more of a female than a male thing, actually. And that it starts coming out of him. He starts talking about killing people, wanting to murder someone. And there's the famous joke where, what business are you in? And murder and executions, he says, and the person hears it as mergers and acquisitions. And see, the bigger joke is that these people only hear what they want to hear. Right from the very beginning of this novel, we are presented with two worlds, the two worlds of New York, the world of the people on top and the world of the people on the bottom. We see many references throughout the novel to the musical Les Miserables, which of course based on the Victor Hugo novel, meaning the wretched of the earth. And we see a great deal of the wretched of the earth beggars, homeless people. And Bateman and his Wall Street pals treat them with utter contempt. It's not so much others would simply ignore them. They find their existence to be amusing. I mean, it's in a way, it's useful to see them because, one feels oneself that much richer when one is compared to people who have nothing. There are references to death right from the very beginnings, things scrawled on walls. I've made some notes here. Patrick Bateman is a great admirer of Donald Trump. Not because Donald Trump is assumed to be a serial killer, but because he is just such a successful man, larger than life. One imagines that a more well-adjusted version of Patrick Bateman could become like Donald Trump. And we see that our hero, our anti-hero, he constantly watches something called the Patty Winters Show, which is one of those, like Jerry Springer, say, with just horrible, disgusting topics. Man, I didn't think the world could be worse than it was until I saw this morning's Patty Winters Show, that sort of thing. I mentioned the innumerable references to pop culture, particularly popular music, but I was greatly amused by two things. That one, he attributes the author, Alice, attributes the song Dancing in the Streets to the Shirelles, when, of course, it was Martha and the Vandellas. There have been many, many cover versions, including an absolutely atrocious one by David Bowie and Mick Jagger, but the Shirelles never covered the song. Perhaps that's an example of the unreliable narrator that we hear so much about, particularly with regard to this. And at one point, he talks about listening to Paul Butterfield. And I thought, how old is this guy? Paul Butterfield? Really? It also doesn't seem to be the kind of music that he would like, because Paul Butterfield was, pretty authentic, I suppose you could say. Yes, it was a bunch of white boys playing the blues, but they wanted to get it right. Bateman is driven mad by what? By consumerism, I suppose you could say. By mimetic desire, as Rene Girard called it. Everything, the world of Bateman and people like him is purely transactional. How much do I want this? How much does it cost? And of course, Bateman's views of women is largely the same, transactional. How much do they cost? How much money will I have to spend on them? In restaurant meals, and we're constantly reminded just how much each restaurant meal costs, and that is paid for with his platinum Amex card. And perhaps, more to the point, or even worse, how much time he will have to spend with these women, particularly time pretending to care about their lives. In Bateman's world, there is no understanding that one might want to spend time with a woman for a reason other than sexual intercourse. I should warn potential readers that this novel is it's exceedingly graphic. It might be even said to be pornographic, although the definition of pornography is that which excites sexual desire. And I don't know that very many people could claim honestly that the graphic sex scenes in American Psycho are meant to or do actually incite sexual desire. Yes. And of course, it's all about brand names. Now, okay, I guess Ian Fleming invented this style of literature where you could talk about brand names, and then what do they call it? the bonking novels in Britain in the 1980s, or these sophisticated women. Well, no, sorry, Sex and Shopping. That's what they call them. Even Julie Burchill wrote one. It's all about these young things who do a lot of shopping, and we find out what the brand names are, and they have a lot of sex too. It's clear that Sex and the City was, inspired by these British sex and shopping novels. But Ellis has a very entertaining style, and he rather drowns readers in specificity. That doesn't sound very appealing, but in this case, it is. And I wanted to give you some examples. A May Dawn. Okay, start with that one, where it's a lot of work involved. In being a metrosexual? That term came later. Morning, in the early light of a May dawn, this is what the living room of my apartment looks like. Over the white marble and granite gas log fireplace hangs an original David Onica. It's a 6-foot by 4-foot portrait of a naked woman, mostly done in muted grays and olives, sitting on a chaise longue watching MTV. The backdrop, a Martian landscape, a gleaming mauve desert scattered with dead gutted fish, smashed plates rising like a sunburst over the woman's yellow head, and the whole thing is framed in black aluminum steel. The painting overlooks a long, white downfilled sofa and a 30-inch digital TV set from Toshiba. It's a high-contrast, highly defined model, plus it has a 4-corner video stand with a high-tech tube combination from NEC, with a picture-in-picture digital effects system plus freeze frame. The audio includes built-in MTS and a 5-watt per channel onboard amp. A Toshiba VCR sits in a glass case beneath the TV set. It's a super high-band beta unit and has built-in editing function, including a character generator with 8-page memory, a high-band record and playback, and 3-week 8-event timer. A Hurricane halogen lamp is placed in each corner of the living room. Thin white Venetian blinds cover all 8 floor-to-ceiling windows. A glass top coffee table by Oak Legs by Turchin sits in the front of the sofa with Steuben glass animals placed strategically around expensive crystal ashtrays from Fortinoff, though I don't smoke. Next to the Wurlitzer jukebox is a black ebony Baldwin concert grand piano. A polished white oak floor runs throughout the apartment. On the other side of the room, next to a desk and a magazine rack by Gio Ponti, is a complete stereo system, CD player, tape deck, tuner, amplifier by Sansui, with 6-foot Duntech Sovereign 2001 speakers in Brazilian rosewood. A downfilled futon lies on an oakwood frame in the center of the bedroom. Against the wall is a Panasonic 31-inch set with a direct view screen and stereo sound, and beneath it in a glass case is a Toshiba VCR. I'm not sure if the time on the Sony digital alarm clock is correct, so I have to sit up and then look down at the time flashing on and off on the VCR, then pick up the Ettore Sotsas push-button phone that rests on the steel and glass nightstand next to the bed and dial the time number. A cream, leather, steel, and wood chair designed by Eric Marcus is in one corner of the room and a molded plywood chair in the other. A black-dotted beige and white mod sienna carpet covers most of the floor. One wall is hidden by 4 chests of immense bleached mahogany drawers. In bed, I'm wearing Ralph Lauren silk pajamas, and when I get up, I slip on a paisley ancient madder robe and walk to the bathroom. I urinate while trying to make out the puffiness of my reflection in the glass that encases a baseball poster hung above the toilet. After I change into Ralph Lauren monogrammed boxer shorts and a Fair Isle sweater and slide into silk polka dot Enrico Hidalin slippers, I tie a plastic ice pack around my face and commence with the morning's stretching exercises. Afterwards, I stand in front of a chrome and acrylic washmobile bathroom sink with soap dish, cup holder, and railings that serve as towel bars, which I bought at Hastings Tile to use while the marble sinks I ordered from Finland are being sanded, and stare at my reflection with the ice pack still on. I pour some anti-plaque formula into a stainless steel tumbler and swish it around my mouth for 30 seconds. Then I squeeze Rembrandt onto a faux tortoiseshell toothbrush and start brushing my teeth. Too hungover to floss properly, but maybe I flossed before bed last night, and rinse with Listerine. Then I inspect my hands and use a nail brush. I take the ice pack mask off and use a deep pore cleanser lotion, then an herb mint facial mask, which I leave on for 10 minutes while I check my toenails. Then I use the Pro Bright tooth polisher and next the Interplaque tooth polisher, this in addition to the toothbrush, which has a speed of 4,200 RPM and reverses direction 46 times per second. The larger tufts clean between teeth and massage the gums, while the short ones scrub the tooth surfaces. I rinse again with Cepacol. I wash the facial massage off with a spearmint face scrub. The shower has a universal all-directional shower head that adjusts within a 30-inch vertical range. It's made from Australian gold black brass and covered with a white enamel finish. In the shower, I use first a water-activated gel cleanser, then a honey almond body scrub, and on the face an exfoliating gel scrub. Vidal Sassoon shampoo is especially good at getting rid of the coating of dried perspiration, salts, oils, airborne pollutants, and dirt that can weigh down hair and flatten it to the scalp, which can make you look older. It goes on like this for hundreds and hundreds of words more, and you might think that it gets boring. Well, it doesn't to me. I just find it absolutely hilarious, actually. Just the accretion of crushing detail. That's one of the things that's driving Patrick Bateman mad, of course, but is also his copious use of alcohol, cocaine, and other drugs, including antidepressants and benzos. Such that there's been a long controversy about this book, about the things that are depicted in them, how many of them actually happened at all. Or is this all just a fever dream of the narrator? Well, of course, there's a vast gulf between thought and action, but the fact that Patrick Bateman, at the very least, wants to perform all of the atrocities that he does is disturbing enough. But there are also hilarious, what you could say, sidebars. And one is his Patrick Bateman's obsession with Phil Collins. I've been a big Genesis fan ever since the release of their 1980 album, Duke. Before that, I didn't really understand any of their work, though on their last album of the 1970s, The Concept Laden and Then There Were Three, a reference to band member Peter Gabriel, who left the group to start a lame solo career, I did enjoy the lovely Follow You, Follow Me. Otherwise, all the albums before Duke seemed too artsy, too intellectual. It was Duke, Atlantic, 1980, where Phil Collins' presence became more apparent and the music got more modern, the drum machine became more prevalent, and the lyrics started getting less mystical and more specific, maybe because of Peter Gabriel's departure. And complex, ambiguous studies of loss became instead smashing first-rate pop songs that I gratefully embraced. The songs themselves seemed arranged more around Collins' drumming than Mike Rutherford's bass lines or Tony Banks' keyboard riffs. A classic example of this is Misunderstanding, which not only was the group's first big hit of the 80s, but also seemed to set the tone for the rest of their albums as the decade progressed. The other standout on Duke is Turn It On Again, which is about the negative effects of television. On the other hand, Heath A's is a song I just don't understand, while Please Don't Ask is a touching love song written to a separated wife who regains custody of the couple's child. Has the negative aspect of divorce ever been rendered in more intimate terms by a rock and roll group? I don't think so. Duke Travels and Duke's End might mean something, but since the lyrics aren't printed, it's hard to tell what Collins is singing about, although there is complex, gorgeous piano work by Tony Banks on the latter work. The only bummer about Duke is Alone Tonight, which is way too reminiscent of Tonight, Tonight, Tonight from the group's later masterpiece, Invisible Touch, and the only example, really, of where Collins has plagiarized himself. Okay. Has the negative aspect of divorce ever been rendered in more intimate terms by a rock and roll group? How about ABBA? They did it many, many times. The Winner Takes It All, Knowing Me, Knowing You, and there are others. He then goes on to review Abacab, Atlantic, 1981, at great length, and mentions that Hugh Padgham had taken over as producer and also produced Genesis, Atlantic, 1983. Padgham does a brilliant job of producing, but the material is weaker than usual, and you can sense the strain. Then he talks about Invisible Touch, Atlantic, 1986. Phil Collins' solo efforts seem to be more commercial and therefore more satisfying in a narrower way, especially No Jacket Required and songs like In the Air Tonight and Against All Odds, although that song was overshadowed by the masterful movie from which it came, and Take Me Home and Susudio, great song, a personal favorite, and his remake of You Can't Hurry Love, which I'm not alone in thinking is better than Supreme's original. And again, I simply can't help laughing. And I think one more here. Coming slowly up the street. Get this in. And we'll be there in a second. Or will we? No, there's a scene in which Patrick Bateman encounters here we go. Coming slowly up the street is an old queer wearing a cashmere turtleneck, a paisley wool ascot, and a felt hat, walking a brown and white Shar-Pei. Its bunched up face sniffing low to the ground. The two of them get closer, passing beneath one street lamp then another, and I've composed myself sufficiently to slowly take off the Walkman and inconspicuously unlock the briefcase. I'm standing in the middle of the thin strip of sidewalk next to a white BMW 320i, and the queer with the sharp eye is now within feet of me, and I get a good look at him, late 50s, pudgy, with obscenely healthy-looking pink skin, no wrinkles, all of this topped off with a ridiculous mustache that accentuates his feminine features. Yeah, things get ugly pretty quickly. And there's another scene where he comes across what was then called a gay pride parade, which was new at the time. It was the late 80s when this first started. And he is disgusted by it. This idea of, love me or cheer me, applaud me because I am gay. This does not appeal to Patrick Bateman. And I assume very strongly that it does not appeal to our author as well. Oh, yes, they're singing, Stephen Sondheim, there's a place for us somewhere, a place for us. That was when, let's say, the Alphabet People agenda was a little more modest, when you're begging that somewhere there is a place for us. Of course, this obsession with personal grooming, the state of one's body and personal grooming, seems pretty gay. I remember reading T.S. Eliot was a fastidious man and quite well dressed, but his tailor marveled of him that there was never anything quite in excess about him. And I very much doubt that T.S. Eliot, walking down the street, would be, pointing out in his mind the whoever it was that designed or made this shirt, this blouse, these shoes, etc., etc. Of course, Eliot's suits were bespoke, so he could only, boast about his tailor. Not that Eliot would have done that. It's curious to me that American Psycho is considered one of the great novels, or great late last century novels, about the plight of the American male. And of course, the other one is Fight Club, which came out in 1996 by Chuck Palahniuk. And Chuck Palahniuk, similarly to Bret Easton Ellis, was very coy about his sexuality for many years, and then finally admitted what most people had worked out, that he was homosexual. I don't know, perhaps it's homosexuals who think about masculinity more than heterosexuals. That's something to consider. Anyway, those are my thoughts on American Psycho. I found it a very amusing novel and rather profound. Although I'm not all that keen on the graphic depiction of sexual activity in novels. And some of you may be more or less keen than I am. Let's have a final look at the chat. Oscar Toe says Phil put on a good show at Live Aid. What, the first half or the second half? Because there was all these complaints when he was playing with Led Zeppelin that he made a hash of it. What a Palp Casso? Not bad, so bad for typical 80s fare. James Woods, Rachel Ward, Jeff Bridges. Let's see. Oh, okay, we're talking about the virus here. Star Rover says, when I saw Phil Collins in concert, he just didn't project any energy. He seemed to be going through the motions. I saw him play with Genesis once when Peter Gabriel was in the group. He seemed to be projecting a lot of energy then, particularly when he went up front to, I believe he was allowed to sing sing solo on 2 songs. And we got a bunch of against all odds. Okay. Oscar Bate. Don Willis says, I can't slam you to the early years. Sunday Bloody Sunday I will follow. Then there's the masterpiece Angel of Harlem, About My Lady Day, Hard to Hate Him. Bono does get sanctimonious. I was greatly amused some years ago when I found out that his peers in the industry had taken to calling him Mrs. Winterbottom because, he's fat. Yes, he's unbearable. It was Dennis Dale who pointed out to me the probable significance of those absurd glasses that he wears. You know what I'm talking about. And I had thought, oh no, he's just being annoying as he's always being annoying. And Dennis Dale said, Bono can say, I'm literally seeing the world through rose-tinted spectacles. How about that, huh? Okay. So anything else? I saw okay. Ooh, Texas Feral Hog does not like Phil Collins on stage. I feel very sorry for him now. We all know the story of his first marriage. He married a woman from West Vancouver in Canada, and she cheated on him, and he wrote a famous song about it, What in the Air Tonight. And the second marriage, did he divorce her by fax? I think he did. And then his third marriage is just an absolute horror story. That woman that he married, you had no idea that she was going to look as she does like 15, 20 years later. Because she looks like a Halloween costume, or something in a horror film. Every time I see a picture of this woman, because their legal battles are ongoing, I just flinch and make it a little terrified sound. Organ's Iron says KMG, men caring for clothes is really cultural. European men several centuries ago were quite into fashion. Same for some contemporary cultures where men care a lot about nice clothes to impress girls. Well, there's one thing about nice clothes to impress girls. Oh no one is wearing this kind of collar anymore. What, you're saying that I dress like my father? No. You see, that was okay 2 years ago, but it's not okay now. That seems to me to be an obsessional interest in clothing, and it just seems effeminate to me at best. Let's answer a question here. I think the answer is yes. Huey Lewis and the News. Huey Lewis and the News burst out of San Francisco onto the national music scene at the beginning of the decade with their self-titled rock pop album released by Chrysalis, though they didn't really come into their own, commercially or artistically, until their 1983 smash, Sports. Though the roots were visible, blues, Memphis soul, country, on Huey Lewis and the News, they seemed a little too willing to cash in on the late 70s, early 80s taste for new wave, and the album, though it's still a smashing debut, seems a little too stark, too punk, and it goes on and on. I kind of missed a trick there. Blues, Memphis soul, country. Huey Lewis is from the Bay Area, and there was a particular scene there in the Bay Area from starting in the 1950s, it was still going strong in the 1970s and 80s. And Huey Lewis was very much a part of that. Yes, so it just goes on for thousands of words about Huey Lewis, which again, I find very amusing because of the idea that, I'm going to tell you about myself. And, I can define myself through my love of Genesis and Phil Collins and Huey Lewis, amongst others. Oscar Toe says I could listen to Bateman review 80s music all day. Anarin says, okay, thanks. His going on about them is one of the funniest bits in the movie. Quachalango says, without being a dandy. Well, we all know the dandies of the English past. Again, I really think that an obsession with personal appearance is a very strong mark of decadence. Jeffrey Pye says, Huey Lewis was my first rock show. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up for the week. Thank you all for tuning in. I'll be back on the air Monday at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And what am I talking about on Monday? I have something to say about music. It is Music Monday after all. Let's see. Just give me a sec here and I'll have it for you. It is Don Giovanni by Mozart and Da Ponte. Not my favorite opera. It's my second favorite opera. But it is a work of genius, both musically and lyrically. And it tells us a great deal about, well, men and women. I suppose it's going to be canceled soon. Ooh, the horrible, horrible Don. Well, it's not as if he's attacking these women. They are drawn to him for his qualities. And, of course, afterwards they pretend that, oh, no, what a beastly, beastly man. Well, I suppose it was his beastliness that draw them to him. So if you would like to make a donation to the live stream, which would be gratefully appreciated, well, especially now, given the uncertainty of my residence, my PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made to the live stream directly via Interac at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.